Welcome back to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and this is part 3 of 8 in our series of adapting the adventure module Rime of the Frostmaiden, Icewind Dale, to a Dark Sun campaign. Last video, we covered the introductory section of the module, Welcome to the Far North, in addition to reviewing a few overall mechanical changes that will be pursued throughout our conversion. And in this video, we're going to cover the first chapter, the 10 Towns section. Now, the first thing to note about the 10 Towns is this chapter has, depending on your count, 13 or 14 adventures. And yet the chapter is supposed to take your PCs from levels 1 to 4. Now, how many of those adventures do you actually need in order to get your PCs from level 1 to level 4? Well, 3. 1 to get them from level 1 to level 2, 1 to get them from level 2 to level 3, and 1 to get them from level 3 to level 4. That's it. Now, if you wanted a real deep dive into the area and you wanted to savor those early levels, of course you would want to convert more of these 10 towns and their adventures. But we are being lazy, easy, and convenient. So we are going to take 3 of the adventures from this chapter, which has 14 or so, and we are going to convert them and make them into Dark Sun material before moving on to cover some wilderness encounters. Now, before we proceed, I do want to mention something which I unintentionally left out in the last video. I meant to cover rules for dehydration, and I'm going to cover them right now instead. Here's the big deal. It's not that complicated. You just look on page 37 of Tomb of Annihilation, and you note the rules for dehydration here. The important part is just in that middle paragraph. Characters will need to drink 2 gallons of water a day, and if they don't, they have to succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw or else suffer 1 level of exhaustion until they drink water. Depending on how you're traveling and what you're wearing, you can incur penalties to that saving throw, and you'll have to remember to make sure that whatever you're traveling with or whoever you're traveling with also drinks water. We'll keep this in mind and refer back to it as we continue our conversion. Now, let's take a look at the 10 Towns chapter. So here we are, chapter 1, 10 Towns. There's some advice on running this chapter and about which town to start with. Since you're following my guidance, you don't need to worry about that. We are going to do the following 3. Bryn Shander, Tourmaline, and Caer Koenig. The rest will leave by the wayside, or if you are inspired by the conversions in this video, you might want to convert some of them yourself. Now here we have a table of rumors, but here's the thing. Something very exciting has happened in our setting. The Sorcerer King Kalek has been overthrown, and with a single stroke, the former Templars who took power have outlawed slavery. Now everyone is free, everyone is pursuing new vocations and trying new things. There's a lot of talk, everyone wants to understand what is happening, and it has all the excitement of the most optimistic revolution you could imagine, along with all the fears of what everyone associates with a revolution gone wrong. The characters will begin in Bryn Shander, and they will take up the quest Foaming Mugs, except for we're not going to call it that, and the town will not be Bryn Shander, but the village of Saltview. Once they complete that quest, they will advance to level 2, and then they're going to go to the city of Tyr, specifically to the smithing district, whose content is a reskinned version of Tourmaline. I wanted to know if it's Tourmaline or Tourmaline, and I checked the pronunciation guide, and they don't even have it here. Oh well. I'll call it Tourmaline. Now, when it comes to winter survival gear here, the corresponding equipment would be desert survival gear. But we're going to ignore that for now. Characters are going to be wearing simple flowing robes which allow them protection from the dehydrating winds of Athos, at the same time being as light as possible to minimize additional heat. Any armor they wear presumably could be worn under that. We'll get to armor in a second. When it comes to getting around the 10 towns, we're going to keep all of the stats for the dog sleds and the axe beaks. We're just going to replace the dog sleds with sleds that are pulled by enixes or kanks, and likewise we're going to replace axe beaks with enixes. Again, enixes are just big domesticated lizards. I imagine giant Gila monsters, sorta, kinda, but you can ride them around and they can pull carts and things like that. We are going to skip the sacrifices to Auril section because, as I mentioned in the last video, we are ignoring that section of the module. Auril does not exist, there's no corresponding Dark Sun version of Auril. We're throwing out that entire aspect of the module in our conversion. So if ever it mentions any sacrifices in the 10 towns made to Auril or having to deal with Auril through sacrifice, just ignore that stuff. Likewise, we're ignoring Cold Open, whether it's the Cold-Hearted Killer or the Chwinga quest. We're just going to skip past that and begin in the town itself. We're specifically beginning in Bryn Shander, but we're not calling it Bryn Shander. As I said, we're going to call it the Village of Saltview. And this is a village which, not in the original 2nd edition Dark Sun setting, but in our version of the setting, is going to be maybe a 2 days journey from the city of Tyr. Because it's so close to the city of Tyr, it is in the immediate range of the practical effects of the revolution which overthrew the Sorcerer King Kalek. And so the entire town is abrim with rumor and excitement. The slaves are excited to be freed. The merchants are troubled about who they're going to trade with. And so many people are wondering, what should I do now? What about the future? So this is going to be the village of Saltview. When it comes to the leaders of Saltview, what I like to do when I convert things, because I'm lazy, is I like to take one of the names of the NPCs, like in this case, Duvessa, and just take the first syllable or so and put it to the end of the name instead of at the beginning. So this will be Vesadu. We'll say that it's Speaker Vesadu. And Sheriff, I like the name Markham more than Southwell. Southwell sounds too germane to the real world. Kamar. So we've got Speaker Vesadu and Sheriff Kamar. That sounds cool. Sheriff Kamar and Speaker Vesadu. We'll just let them look like this, except for they're obviously not going to be wearing winter gear. Going back, what do we have in town? Black iron blades, okay? So this is a shop and smithy. It's run by Garn the Hammer and his sister Elza. We'll just let them be the same people. They're both dwarves, hairless dwarves of Dark Sun, and they sell adventuring supplies. As we specified before, anything that they are said to sell here, we're going to describe as being sold, except for that it's made of bone or chitin. Now it says here that there's a rumor around town that the things that Garn sells are of subpar quality, but we're just going to let that be a rumor. It's an interesting rumor, but it'll lead to a dead end if the players try to investigate it. I think one good idea here is to have Garn the Hammer ask the player characters for monster parts if they're ever going to venture beyond the deserts and plan to survive. This is an NPC who's really interested in getting the jaws of an ankheg to make an axe out of, or the tentacles of a grick which can be used to make the most powerful leather, or the eyeballs of a carrion crawler which can be used to make a salve that will protect you from the sun. But the point is, you should make Garn interested in monster parts and vocal about that to the PCs. When you do, you can forecast to the players what kinds of monsters they're likely to encounter once they go outside the village. As for what kinds of monsters they will encounter, that'll be in the video for next chapter. We're going to have a whole table of wilderness encounters, and it will include all kinds of fun things. Next up, House of the Morning Lord. We're not going to call it that, we're going to call it Shrine of the Green Earth. And this is a druid grove. There's a neutral good druid named Hanmis, who conjures water for the community, and who is relieved that the Sorcerer King has been overthrown. Hanmis has a Thry-Kreen assistant named Copper, who I imagine as being a kind of fish-out-of-water character. And then we've got the Northlook. That's a pretty good name for a tavern, but since it's Dark Sun, I might want to name it something after water, because that's seen as such a symbol of rest and relief. Call it the Oasis. Or maybe, taking a cue from Curse of Strahd, call it the Blue Water Inn. That is where our adventure is going to begin. We're going to start here. Ol' Bitey, we're going to change that into a giant dragonfly that has multiple eyes and some nasty looking horns and talons. If the player characters ever have a wilderness encounter, which in Rime of the Frostmaiden would have been a pair of perytons, we're going to change those perytons, reskinning them into these kinds of monstrous dragonflies. One of them is mounted on the wall. I wouldn't have it sing, that kind of conflicts with the mood of Dark Sun, but if you like it, you include it. And now we begin the quest, Foaming Mugs. So what happens are a crew of dwarves who were attacked in the desert come up to the adventurers, see that they are equipped for adventuring, and ask them if they wouldn't mind going out into the desert and recovering their lost cargo. Translating the flavor text to our setting, it would be something like this. 3 stocky figures in harsh leather garments come towards you, water skins slung over their shoulders and fastened to their belts. 2 of them are armed with bone swords. The third holds up a tattooed hand and says, "Well met, I'm Runa, and these are my friends, Orcs and Storn. We need your help, and you look capable." We'll stat them the same way. Of course, we're going to treat them like being Dark Sun dwarves and not Forgotten Realms dwarves. They're not wearing winter gear, they're not hairy, but they have actually lost a shipment of iron ingots. And because this is Athos, that shipment is incredibly valuable. Iron, it's like treasure. Now it turns out that these dwarves got that shipment from a mine which is recently reopened after the overthrow of King Kalek in the smithing district of Tyr. And for that we're going to use the city of Tourmaline. They are coming from Tourmaline with that shipment of ingots, some 2 days' journey, and on the way they were waylaid. They haven't the means to defend themselves to go back and retrieve the ingots, and they're asking the adventurers to do so. Since the ingots are treasure, they can surely promise the characters wealth if they accept this quest. In the flavor text, instead of mentioning a yeti, mention a grick. Gricks and yetis have similar challenge ratings, and I find that they behave as similar sorts of opponents in combat for low-level player characters. And also, each one has a souped-up version, the Abominable Yeti in one case, and the Grick Alpha in another. So when we get to reskinning the wilderness encounters for the next chapter, those yetis will become gricks. And so in this case, instead of being waylaid by a yeti, we're going to say that the dwarves were waylaid by a grick. Assuming the player characters accept the quest, they're going to head out and follow some vague directions which the dwarves provided. We're going to say that they are directed to the north, towards Tyr. And as the player characters exit the inn, they can see the streets of Saltview alive with hope and excitement. Some people are dancing and celebrating, other people are on top of soapboxes or pedestals, and they are reading out what they think should be done now that the Sorcerer King is overthrown. There are people painting murals dedicated to the gladiators who are alleged to have destroyed the regime of King Kalik. Murals to the people, murals to the liberated slaves. I imagine that there must be a banner or some kind of popular symbol, which is just the symbol of broken chains, and that everyone is painting that everywhere and waving it around. And of course, on their way out, the player characters could visit Hanmis or Garn, or just interact with some random NPCs. So, once they set out, the very first thing that happens is they come across a blizzard. Now, in our version of the module, it's not a blizzard, it's a sandstorm, so just call it that. A sandstorm descends upon you, reducing visibility to 20 feet. Tyr vanishes from view as the blowing sand and howling wind engulf you. You ask the player characters what they're going to do. The sandstorm lasts for 2d4 hours, and you just kind of ad-lib and roleplay for a bit. Here you come to Ubok's remains, Ubok being one of the dwarves. It's pretty gross and grisly. You find the remains, he's mostly eaten, and there are some recent tracks left behind. Just keep the flavor text the same, replace the word snow with the word sand, and you should be good. And then the player characters come across goblins. Except they're not going to be goblins in our version of the story. They are going to be halflings. These halflings live in the jungle which surrounds the lost city. They were sent towards Tyr because their elder had instructed them that there was a change in the energies abroad and that need to investigate. They came across the dwarven shipment of iron right after the attack, so what they found was an abandoned sled and they are taking it back to their home. So instead of goblins, we're going to have halflings. They're going to look like hobbits, except for their hair is wild and tangled. They're muscular and fierce, and they're covered in all kinds of angular, symbolic-looking tattoos. Now, if one of your player characters is unique and mysterious, and if, because they are unique and mysterious, they were found as a child in possession of some artifact which, secretly, unbeknownst to them, came from the lost city with which we will replace Ythryn, it might be fun now to have one of the halflings possess an exactly similar item on them. As described in the module here, we're going to make these halflings hostile, and we're going to say that they do not speak any language which the player characters know. They speak their own insular, unique halfling language. Nobody else outside of the jungles knows that language, and certainly the player characters couldn't know it. Furthermore, these halflings are not endowed with the gift of telepathy. Instead, they are endowed with the gift of telekinesis. Not much use for communication, unfortunately. Instead of bears, we're going to say that these halflings have trained kenks or enixes. I would go with kenks, I like giant beetles. And the same sorts of challenges would exist in approaching them and making checks to deal with them and letting them free versus having to fight them, etc. When it comes to the stat block you would use if the player characters end up fighting the polar bears, just use the same stats as polar bears but describe them as giant beetles. And if the player characters are successful, we conclude the quest. They find so much iron that they can take back. And this is an important shipment of iron. It is the very first such shipment which has been sent out since the overthrow of King Kalik. And because metal is so rare and precious, it symbolizes that people have returned to the mines, that the city will return to life, and that in some sense, all is getting better. When the player characters finish this quest, have them advance to level 2. And that is our version of Bryn Shander. Up next is the village of Tourmaline in the Rime of the Frostmaiden. However, it's not going to be Tourmaline in our version of the story, it's going to be the smithing district of Tyr. Now the question, of course, is why do the player characters leave the village of Saltview and go to Tyr? And I would handle it this way. You want to make sure that the encounter with the halflings is as mysterious and weird as possible. You want it to pose a question, and to have the player characters repeat that question around town. What is this mysterious artifact? Why were there halflings? Who are they? Whoever they're talking to will say, oh, You can probably find the answer in the big city of Tyr. Go to Tyr. And in short, have the NPCs in Saltview point everyone towards Tyr. When they get to Tyr, have them arrive in the smithing district. And for the smithing district, we are going to use the town of Tourmaline, and specifically its adventure, A Beautiful Mine. Now when it comes to the smithing district of Tyr, here's how things have gone. During the reign of the Sorcerer King Kalak, especially in the very latter couple of months, all of the smithing district was shut down. Mines closed, bone-working and stone-working shops closed, because everyone was ordered to begin building that ziggurat for King Kalak, which was going to facilitate his ascendancy to dragonhood. He ordered the shutdown of the entire economy, and for all persons, to proceed directly to the ziggurat and work non-stop to its completion. That was when he was overthrown. Now that he's been overthrown, the smithing district has returned to life. People have eagerly gone back to stoneworking and leatherworking and trying to mine, but I say trying. Unfortunately, the biggest and most important mine in the smithing district has recently been occupied by troglodytes who won't get out, who are very hostile, and who have apparently killed at least a couple of miners. That's the first thing that the player characters are going to learn when they arrive here in the smithing district of Tyr, is that the mine, which is the center of that district's economy, has been occupied. We're going to begin the quest in the same way that the quest here begins. Someone is going to walk up to the player characters and just say, "Wow, looks like you're ready for some trouble. I guess that means you're here about the mine, aren't you?" The player characters will ask, "What mine?" or something to that effect, and at that point, you can offer a hefty reward to the player characters if only they deal with the mine troubles. If the player characters ask about anything else, you should have the NPCs be in such a mood as to say, "No time to worry about that, someone has to deal with this mine problem." Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, clue, clue. Now, you don't have to railroad them immediately towards that. Of course, there are locations in the smithing district, including a place called the Blue Wave. It's not called the Blue Clam, because this is Athos. What's a clam? We'll call it the Blue Wave, an optimistic name for a place of rest, especially in a desert. Although in Rime of the Frostmaiden, this town is described as being for fishermen, it's not for fishermen, it's for miners and smiths. So this is sort of a miner's tavern. The East Side Inn is run by a human named Tamar, and her father Deckley, and we are going to ignore the quest with the Ring of Warmth and all of that, unless of course you feel like converting it yourself. We're ignoring it. And so we begin. The player characters encounter someone who's clad in desert garments, who approaches and tells them that they can get up to 50 jade pieces if they clear out this mine from troglodytes. Assuming the player characters accept, we begin. Here are some changes we're going to make to the mine. First of all, outside of the mine, it's going to say reptiles only. Not kobolds only, it'll say reptiles only. And, as with the original story, the fact that there is a sign here should give away something odd. Troglodytes don't generally read, and they certainly don't write. So who made that sign? That should be the first question. Now, it turns out that in this version of the module, in Rite of the Frostmaiden, the kobolds are being commanded by a kobold who's possessed by a ghost. That endows the kobold with additional intelligence, and it has been orchestrating the occupation of the mine. In our version of the dungeon, we're going to say that the troglodytes have come to occupy the mine because they are being led by a Yuan-Ti brood guard. You can find the stats for a Yuan-Ti brood guard in Volo's Guide to Monsters, but if you don't have that, just use the stats for a Yuan-Ti Trueblood from the Monster Manual and describe it as looking like a brood guard, looking like an amalgam of snake and humanoid. This creature, this lowly Yuan-Ti, has left its society and decided to boss around a bunch of troglodytes, and their first mission is to occupy this mine as their new home. That's why they're there. So if any of the kobolds are captured, they're going to talk about their leader, who is a snake, a magic snake. The snake led us here. We followed the snake. We believe in the snake. And of course, they'll talk about all the material promises that the Yuan-Ti Broodguard, why not call them Trex? We can keep the name Trex, has promised them. Now, I would say that as the player characters go through this mine, they are definitely going to find metal equipment. You can't mine using tools of bone. You need to break into rock with something harder than rock, and so metal tools for sure are going to be down here. I would just say that whoever gives them the quest, or whoever has the authority to reward the player characters for the quest, would demand a complete inventory of all the tools that can be found down there, so as to emphasize the rarity of metal, and how despite metal's rarity, there are all these metal tools lying around. They're going to be treated as precious items. As for what people are mining in this mine, it's iron. It's not going to be gems or even tourmaline. In our version of the adventure, the place isn't called Tourmaline, so we don't have to worry about the place being named after something they're not mining. It's just the smithing district of Tyr, and they're mining iron. So we'll say small iron deposits in the ridge and the walls of the cave gleam seductively. We're going to keep all of the equipment that the troglodytes have set up. They have set it up under the direction of the Yuan-Ti Broodguard, otherwise they wouldn't be intelligent enough to set it up. And instead of a river of water, because after all this is Dark Sun, we're going to say that it's a river of ooze. It's actually a kind of underground fungal algae, maybe even a single organism if you like, and it is flowing sluggishly, slowly, for miles on end through this underground cavern. Obviously, down at the bottom of the caverns, we're not going to have the Underdark, the Forgotten Realms Underdark. There's going to be, well, whatever you like to be down there, given that it's Dark Sun. Under Athos, or what have you. The Grell is still there. I think that's a wonderful monster to have in this mine. It fits with the Dark Sun setting. Just keep the Grell. At level 2, a Grell is a challenge, but I don't think an unfair one, especially if the player characters are careful. As for Trex, we're going to make this situation rather simple. Trex is going to try to deceive the party members. He will try to say that it's all a big misunderstanding, that the troglodytes mean no harm, that they just came here because they're trying to escape persecution and they seek freedom, or whatever it is. And in the course of his attempts to deceive, if he can tell that the player characters don't believe him, he'll immediately summon all nearby troglodytes to attack, and it will just be a fight. Assuming the player characters succeed in defeating Trex, they ascend to level 3. Now, I like the idea that there are several possible endings here. I would say that with a DC 15 charisma check, the player characters might be able to convince the troglodytes to come up out of the mine and be nice. It sounds a little weird, but I don't think it's unbelievable. I think that players would feel really proud if they managed to do that, especially if you as the DM acted baffled and surprised at their amazing success. I suspect that most parties will just kill the troglodytes, but if they're exceptionally noble or pacifistic, they might try the non-violent solution instead. Anyway, once it's over, they're going to go to the speaker of the town. Following my pattern of mixing up the names, we're going to say that the town speaker is Thumas. Speaker Thumas is the one who can reward them for cleaning out the mine, and he behaves just as described in this passage, except for it's not kobolds, it's troglodytes, and there's no ghost. Now, once the player characters have finished dealing with the mine and the smithing district, they can get their questions answered. What was up with the halflings? What was up with this mysterious item? What's up with the mysterious item I have? And anyone they talk to can lead them to the nobles district. That's who would know. Someone in the nobles district. Go to the nobles district. That's where you should go. And for the nobles district, we are going to use Kerr König. I'm sorry, it's spelled König, but when I see it, I just see the German word König, or king. Kerr König, I see the King's Castle. The place is named King's Castle, but we're going to call it the Nobles District. We'll say that the Nobles District is not too far from the Smithing District, walkable within an hour maybe. If you want some civic urban encounters that have a darker flavor, maybe take some from the appendix to Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, and reskin them so it doesn't describe anyone as wearing gleaming metal armor or anything like that. And once they get to the Nobles District, you should describe it as a place that is relatively tranquil compared to the other areas of the city. The warrens and ghettos to which slaves were formerly confined are now explosive with rejoicing, but the Nobles District had a number of people who were well connected to the Sorcerer King, who are now disenfranchised, seeking new social connections, and afraid in many cases to expose who they were before the revolution. So it's a quieter place. Additionally, the buildings are in better condition, better decorated, and the tavern, which we'll call the Iron Hook, has a ready supply of water thanks to a couple of druids in its employ. We'll say that the druids are named Vinkel and Thrajar, and the owner of the Iron Hook is Darglin. The shop we will call the Expeditionary, and we'll say that it is owned by someone named Nasat. In addition to selling adventuring gear, they also sell or lease the use of kanks for sleds or for pack animals. Giant beetles. We can say that you need 6 giant beetles to pull a sled, just as you need 6 dogs to pull a sled, keep the stats the same, etc., etc. And instead of calling it the Northern Light, we're going to call the inn the Evening Shade, because that's a much more soothing name if you live in a harsh desert. The Evening Shade. It used to have a prominent and decorative awning, but that was recently stolen by a Templar. The Rardish sisters keep this inn. The younger, Leah, does all the cooking and cleaning. The older one, Rico, sees to the provisions. And no matter who they talk to, they're going to be directed eventually to Vustro, the district speaker. Now, Vustro is a Thri-kreen. In Rime of the Frostmaiden, he is described as a dragonborn, but of course, following our rules for restatting NPCs, we're going to say he's a Thri-kreen. He also really enjoys alcohol. I like to think that because they're insects, Thri-kreen do not react well to alcohol, and it has a huge effect on them, an exaggerated effect. And so this Thri-kreen is trying to solve a mystery, but also drinks daily, and so by the end of each day is too intoxicated to actually carry out the investigations, and so the problem continues. Speaking of which, you just describe the player character's first encounter with Vustro in the same way that they encounter Trovis here in the flavor text. Note that the houses are sand-battered, not snow-battered, and similarly the sisters play a certain kind of helpful role when it comes to keeping him alive. Now, just as is described here, the player characters are going to hear from Vustro that there has been an epidemic of break-ins and vandalisms. He suspects that it's from some enclave of Templars, some group of thugs that are still loyal to Sorcerer King Kalak, who are terrorizing the nobles' district in revenge. And he's right! Player characters who look around and investigate will find evidence of crimes and vandalism, and they will also eventually find tracks in the sand which lead towards the outpost, which is a dungeon. Now, here is a nice and convenient thing. The Templars were very rich before they were overthrown. They had lots and lots of metal equipment, and those who fled took it with them. So, as we describe the outpost, we're going to keep all of the equipment as metal. The Templars wear metal armor, they wield metal weapons. There's even metal in the building itself, which was designed as an emergency Templar shelter. So we'll keep just about everything the same, we're just going to re-describe all of the Duergar as being human Templars. They still have all the same stats, they still can enlarge and make themselves invisible, it's just that they are human beings and not gray-skinned dwarves. Whenever they mention snow or ice, of course we're going to replace that with sand or rock. When they mention the chill or deathly cold, we're going to talk about the overwhelming, sweltering heat. And after a fight with Nildar or Darnil, or whatever you want to call him, the players go back to the noble district, and then level up to 4. And at that point, the player characters now have evidence that there is a Templar conspiracy, and that the Sorcerer King Kalak is in fact organizing to attack the city of Tyr. He surely must have a base nearby, and now that these adventurers are so experienced and that they have helped the city of Tyr so much, maybe they can assist in thwarting this horrifying reaction. And so, at this point, the player characters are going to be moved towards the dungeon with which we will replace Sunblight. But before we do that, we need to cover Chapter 2 of the module, which is mostly a series of wilderness encounters. In fact, all of the content in Chapter 2 is kind of disconnected. Many of the places there are connected, but they're connected by way of a specific NPC and what they know, or what they're interested in, or where a certain item is located. There aren't any bigger story beats that link any of the various locations in Chapter 2. That's fine, of course, because if there were, we were going to throw them out anyway and replace them with Dark Sun. But Chapter 2 has like 30 different encounters, 20 random wilderness ones, and then another 10 or so locations with detailed NPCs and maps and things like that. We're not going to adapt all of that, we're just going to take the wilderness encounters table and one of the mapped locations and convert those. And we'll do that next time. Anyway, if you want to be notified when that video goes up, please don't forget to hit that bell icon in addition to liking and subscribing, and thanks very much. I'll see you soon.